I'm Caleb Harris with YouCanMakeThisToo. Thanks for joining me. This time I'm going to be showing how I mill up rough lumber to be perfectly flat and straight. And even if you're not working with rough lumber, if you have lumber that's a little twisted or warped or that you need to correct any issues with, the principles I'm going to show you work for doing that too. Now, milling any type of lumber starts with understanding grain direction. If you already have a handle on that, here's a time code to jump ahead to the milling. Now, there are other videos and especially books that are great resources on really understanding wood grain if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty and understand shrinkage and warp and why boards end up in the shape that they do. But if you're just trying to mill good lumber, you don't have to go too deep, and I'm going to cover some of the basics here. As we all know, trees are generally round and they grow vertically, but they're not the same diameter all the way across. They tend to be a little wider at the base, skinnier at the top. Sometimes they might be a little windblown and go one way. They might have a curve in it. They're not perfectly straight. So apart from the natural grain direction that's introduced into wood as a tree grows, as a taper or a tilt or whatever it may have, once it goes to the sawmill and it's not perfectly round, that sawmill is going to have to adjust the tree in some way for it to be secure in order to get planks out of it. And when they do that, they may exaggerate the grain direction or introduce a different type of flow that we have to account for. Here's a piece of cherry that I've already partly milled so you can really see on the edges how the grain flows. Now, what's really interesting about this is it has a knot. It's really obvious on this side. Now, because of this knot, this has what we call reversing grain. The grain doesn't consistently run one direction. On this side of the knot, the grain is all flowing that way, and on the other side of the knot, the grain's flowing the opposite direction. It reverses. All right, so there's grain direction in wood, but why do we care, and why does this affect how we're going to machine wood? Well, let me show you. All right, in this board, it's fairly easy to see here that the grain is flowing in this direction. Well, before machines, everything was flattened with hand tools, like a plane, which has a blade in it. Now imagine if we pass this plane in this direction and the grain's going that way. What's going to happen mechanically is this blade is going to cut under that grain. And when it does, what does that wood want to do? It wants to lift up. And planes have been designed to help minimize that. That's why this has an adjustable frog, and so you can get this really close to the blade to try to help force the fibers down. But rather than trying to keep the wood from doing what it wants to do, it makes more sense to plane this direction. Because once we're planing this direction and the wood's going this way, as the plane cuts the wood, it's not going to want to lift the fibers out because they're planing in the direction that they're naturally going. The same principle applies on a machine. All right, now we're at my jointer. This is the in-feed side, this is the out-feed side, and you'll see it has this giant cutter head with multiple blades in it. And these blades act just as the blade in a planer would, except it's spinning and taking thousands of cuts a minute. Now, as this board goes over the jointer, you'll see that it has this grain direction. Well, right now, the grain is flowing what we call downhill, which is good because as that blade bites it, since the wood grain is already angled in the direction of the cut, it's not going to try to rip away. If that doesn't make sense, it's easier to see it once we get over here to where the grain is going uphill. You can see now that when that blade bites it, what it might want to do is catch that wood grain and then break it out instead of cutting it clean. And that's why you get tear out sometimes when you're milling, or chip out. So to minimize that, what you want to do is always make sure that you're not cutting uphill, but instead you're cutting downhill with the grain. And this applies whenever you're running something through the jointer or the planer. This is my jointer. It's a little beefier than most, and I'll put a card up to the story on this in case you're curious. But the first start of milling any lumber normally starts at the jointer. If you don't have a jointer, I'll leave a link to a card about a video of ways you can do everything a jointer can do without a jointer. So our goals at the jointer is to get a flat face, a flat edge, and have the two perfectly 90 degrees to each other. Now, as I feed my stock through the jointer, I want to make sure that I'm feeding it downhill. The only problem is this board is so nasty, I really can't tell what direction the grain's flowing. So what I like to do sometimes is run just a really light pass on the edge first, so that way I can see which way the grain's flowing, and then I'll get a flat face. So let's do that. Now the grain in this board is a little wavy here, but it mostly seems to be flowing this way. Now I need to figure out which face I want to joint first, and that's only going to matter if this board has any cup in it. Because if it has any cup in it, I want to make sure that the bow is on the top side, not the bottom. Because if I put the bow down, I don't want this board rocking as I try to feed it through this machine. It's a good way to eat your fingers. Now, I don't see any cup in this board, but the other consideration is if there is any warp in it. And this board is warped slightly this direction. So I want to joint this side first because it has the two high ends for the same reason. I want to knock the high points off the board. So if I try to feed it this way, the board's just going to rock as I go through. But if I feed it with the warp up, you can see it's a lot more stable on the jointer. I finished at the jointer, and you can see that I jointed a different amount off each of these boards, and that's because I want to show where I think most people mess up when they're milling lumber. This board I'm going to bring down to final dimension, about 3/4 of an inch today in one milling session. This one I'm going to take 2 milling sessions on, and this one I'm going to do in 3 milling sessions, which is what I recommend. In between each milling session, I'm going to give these boards a day to 2 to rest. And the reason for that is to give the wood a chance to recover. Because when these were first milled, they were flat and straight. So why aren't they now? Well, all that grain has tension in it, and the board eventually comes to an equilibrium with all the fibers running through it that results in the shape it's at once it dries. And maybe that stays flat, but it probably doesn't. Well, after you remove some of the high bits and some of the low bits, the board has to come back to equilibrium again. And when it does that, it's going to pull itself out of flat. So if you do everything in just one session, then in a few days, you're going to find that your board that you made perfectly flat and square no longer is. And that's why I want to show the difference between 1 milling session, 2 milling sessions, and 3 milling sessions. And this board wasn't particularly warped before I started. It had a slight cup and a slight bow to it, but nothing too severe. Anyway, so now that we have one flat face and one flat edge, we need to get this edge parallel to the edge that we jointed, and this face flat and parallel to the face that we already jointed. It doesn't particularly matter what order we do those 2 steps in, but personally, I prefer to go to the table saw first and rip the other edge, so that way I'm sending less through my planer, it's less strain on the motor and less wear on the blades. And so long as I'm using this face as the reference on the table saw really doesn't care whether the top has been planed or not. Now, before I go to the table saw though, one consideration when you're laying out all your pieces for your project is if you have a board that has a lot of crook in it, which is when the board goes this way, and you plan on ripping smaller pieces out of it, you'll probably want to rip them sooner in the milling, like during the first session. Now, but if my board's fairly stable in that direction, then I'll probably leave this as one solid piece until my last milling session, so that way I just have less individual pieces that I have to put through the process. So last in our milling session is taking the last rough face of the board and making it flat but also parallel to our other face, because we don't want a board that ends up wedge shaped. And that's what we use the planer for. The planer is kind of like the jointer in the sense that it has a rotary cutter head in here behind this shield that spins and takes thousands of cuts a minute. The main difference is it has this reference bed, and the cutter head is above the bed instead of in it like in the jointer. The reason for that is so we can use this side that's already flat as a reference against the bed, and then the cutter head will replicate the shape on the good side onto the opposite side. This is also why you have to face joint at a jointer first, because if we were to just feed this through rough, whatever errors are in this wood, like if it had a warp or something, the planer would simply duplicate. So if you had a board that had a bow in it, then it would just come out of the planer smooth but still bowed. Now, a way to get around that if you don't have a jointer is to create a jointing sled for your planer, which is simply a sled that has a perfectly flat bottom to go against the reference bed of the planer that you can then set your board onto and wedge and shim it so that it's as flat and stable as possible, and then feed it through until you do have a flat edge. And I'll leave a link below to some videos that show how to build those. If you want to help me continue putting videos like this out, there's a few ways you can do that. Just share this on your favorite social media. That actually helps a lot. You can support me on Patreon, and I have a variety of benefits there. You can also click on the Amazon links below before you shop on Amazon. It doesn't change your price, but it helps the channel. Consider buying some merchandise or plans. I have t-shirts and plans to previous projects on my website. All right, so milling session 1 is done, and the 1 session board is right on 3/4 of an inch. My 2 session board is just over 7/8. So I have a little over 1/8 to take off next time I mill it. And my 3 session board is right on 1 inch. So I've got 1/4 of an inch to take off over the next 2 sessions. And depending on how much movement I see this time, I'll decide how much I want to take off of this one in the next session. And each board is flat. Now, I can see a little light in a few spots, but that's because my blades need sharpening. But these are all flat. So let's see what they look like in a few days. All right, so it's Monday, 2 days after I milled these. This is the number 1 board, and you can see it's got a little bit of cup in it, how it rocks. The 2 session board, we'll finish this one off 2 dimension today. It's got a little bit of cup in it too. And then my 3 session board, as you'd expect, it's got some in there too, because the other 2 didn't. This is all the same board. But if I try to get out of this board, it'd be too thin. Have some room left on this board. This board has 2 more sessions. Now the other thing is to see, if it has any bow, because it did have a little bit of bow. This one still looks stable that way, didn't move. This one's also flat. And looks like all 3 did stay flat. Didn't have much of a bow. Did have a slight cup that returned some. So let's mill these 2 again and see how they do. So for you, it's just been a few seconds, but it's Friday now, so 4 days after my last clip. On Monday, I did the second milling on boards 2 and 3, and then I let them rest. On Wednesday, I did a 3rd milling on board number 3. So it's had one milling, 2 millings, and 3 millings. Now it's Friday because I wanted to give board 3 a little bit more time to rest to see what happens. Now, as you remember, board 1 was a little cupped and it's still kind of cupped, but it's also developed this twist. Now I know my table isn't perfectly flat, but that's a lot more twist than an unflat workbench shows, and I'll put this on my jointer and jump to that cut now and show you that this really is twisted. Now board 2 is still pretty stable. It doesn't have a twist like board 1 did. We worked that out. And it does have a very, very slight cut, but I mean, not too bad. Honestly, once you sanded this, you probably wouldn't even notice it. And as far as board 3 goes, it's flat. It's, of course, hasn't had as much time since the milling as the other 2 boards, but I figured in about 2 days it's going to move as much as it's going to move, if it's going to move. So there you go. That's why I like taking 3 milling sessions and giving the boards time to rest in between. As you've seen sometimes, 2 sessions might be enough for your wood, but I definitely don't like going with 1 because if anything changes in your wood, you're just done and you don't have the room to give any flex. Now, how important this is depends on how well you cut joinery in the first place. If you're still kind of new and your joinery is already kind of loose, like mine tends to be, well, then you're really not going to notice if your board's just a touch not perfectly straight or flat anyways. But one place that it always shows up is if you're doing a panel glue up like a tabletop, you definitely want to then take the time to make sure that everything is perfectly flat and square. Take the extra few days to give it time to rest and mill it again. It's going to pay off. And also remember, if you're doing a panel, leave it a little bit thick. So that way after your panel glue up, you have room to sand it and bring it down to final dimension and get rid of, any irregularities in your glue up. Because I don't know about you, but every time I do a panel glue up, my seams are never perfect. Not the kind of perfect that I want to put a finish on. So leave yourself that room. I'm working on a machine substitution series where I go through every machine in my shop and then show other tools that accomplish all the same tasks. And I'll leave a playlist of that up here. Might be worth checking out for you. And if you mill your lumber in a process different from what I showed, please go ahead and leave me a comment below and tell me. I'd really like to hear about it. And if it's better, I might take it. Anyway, till next time, thank you.